Dirty Deeds. My name's Jen. I like to talk about all things knitting and sewing, and we've got a sewing episode today for you because I've just finished my glorious new coat. And despite having made coats and jackets before, I actually learnt quite a lot in the process of making this. I thought I would share it with you, so if you're a complete beginner to coat making, or if you've done a few things and you're looking to improve on your skills, I've got a few tips to share that I think could be really helpful. Hopefully it is. A little bit about my particular coat. This fabric has been in my stash for years, and it was about time it got made up into the coat that it was always intended for. It's a synthetic tweed fabric with bright blue lining, and I made it a really nice warm winter coat by underlining the whole thing as well as putting the lining in. I'm really pleased with the result. I think you'll agree it's quite a cool, stylish looking coat. To make it, I used the Petra Coat pattern by Style Arc Patterns. I really like this pattern. I thought it was brilliantly well drafted. As with most Style Arc patterns, the instructions were fairly minimal, but there was enough there that with my sewing experience I was able to put this coat together. As far as coat constructions go, it's a pretty straightforward make, particularly if you do it as the unlined version, because then you would just follow the instructions letter for letter, because Style Arc designed this as an unlined coat. I really liked the style lines of it, but I really wanted a proper warm winter coat with lining, so I added a lining to it. It's very oversized fit, it's kind of loose and sort of cool looking. I really like that the side seams are brought forward from the actual side of your body and then crossing over with those, and with the split hem at the bottom you've got these pockets which are at an angle, which I think you'll agree in this checked fabric in the end created a really cool effect. So as I said, there's quite a few things that I learned in the process of making this coat, and I think this video is going to be particularly useful for complete beginners to coat making who don't know even where to start, what pattern to choose, what equipment you might need, and hopefully it's going to help you achieve a really nice result for your first coat. First piece of advice I have for you is probably the most important. Choose the right pattern. Obviously you're going to want a coat that suits you, that suits the rest of your wardrobe, that is something that you actually want to wear. That's primarily the purpose of this. We're creating something that we want to be able to use and wear. Second thing to consider is who has designed that pattern. Now there are the big four, big five pattern companies, McCall's, New Look, Vogue, that kind of thing, which come with pretty minimal instructions, or at least if there are detailed instructions, those pattern companies tend to assume you have a certain amount of dressmaking knowledge. So they won't necessarily go into detail of explaining what the markings on the pattern pieces are. They might not give you that much information about what fabrics to choose. You're not going to get the hand-holding step-by-step instructions with a pattern like that. If it's your first coat or you've not been dressmaking for very long, I would recommend going for an indie pattern company, so a small pattern company, perhaps a company that you've used a pattern from before and you liked the instructions. You're going to get much more detailed instructions from a small independent designer. That's kind of what a lot of them specialise in. I made a Style Arc pattern. Style Arc are, although they are an indie pattern designer, they are also known for being fairly minimal on the instructions front. Even with lots and lots of years of sewing experience, I still had a few scratchy head moments putting this together. Now part of that was because I complicated it further for myself by adding a lining to an unlined coat pattern, but I would still say you probably want to stay away from style arc patterns if you've not made a coat before or have not been making clothes for very long. Another thing that you want to be considering when you're choosing your pattern is to go for something with very simple style lines to start you off. Try to stay away from very complicated collars, lots and lots of seaming details. Stay away from things like this one has, like a split hem, because that just adds further complication. You want to go as simple as possible for your first one. That would be my advice. The best way to see this is look at the style line pictures, the drawn out pictures of what the pattern looks like on the pattern website or on the pattern packet. You're looking for as few lines on that garment as possible, because those lines will be where the seams are, and we want to minimize the amount of seams that we're going to have to sew and press and clip and do all the other things to get a good finish. It's better to have fewer seam lines, finish them really well, end up with a really polished looking item, than going for an overcomplicated design that's probably going to take you weeks and weeks to make if you're not experienced in this area, and you're probably going to run out of steam halfway through and wish you'd never started. So simpler the better if you've not made a coat before. And finally, don't do what I did if you've never made a coat before. If you want a lined coat, specifically choose a pattern that is for a lined coat. If you want an unlined coat, specifically choose a pattern that's for an unlined coat. Although they can be interchangeable, as I have proved here, it's an unlined coat pattern, I have successfully managed to line this nicely, I would recommend that you get a pattern that suits what you're actually wanting to make so that you can follow the instructions to the letter. I felt like the challenge of lining an unlined pattern was what I wanted to do, but if this is your first foray into coat making, perhaps not the best idea. The second big area that you want to make sure that you get right when you're embarking on your first coat project is choosing the right fabric. There are so many options for this. I would recommend for your first coat project that you choose something really stable without too much stretch, nothing too drapey or slinky. I would recommend something like a wool, a boiled wool, or an imitation wool coat fabric. It's going to be something quite stable, it's going to be quite thick. It's probably going to press okay so that you can get nice looking seams. It's not going to stretch out of shape too easily, and it's going to be relatively easy to work with for your first coat. You could also, if you wanted a more casual look, choose something like a cotton canvas, like a duck canvas, something like that. I chose something that actually was a really difficult fabric to work with. It's a tweed type woven fabric in which the individual threads making up the fabric are really thick and it's quite loosely woven. So this meant that it frayed like nobody's business. And a lot of the way that I made this coat was actually designed to mitigate a lot of that fraying problem and solve that problem as I was going through the making process. If you want to avoid things like that, go for a fabric that's not going to fray easily. Something like a boiled wool or a felted fabric is going to be much better because you can cut it and it won't fray. You're not going to have to think about finishing the edges so neatly. It's going to play a lot nicer for you if you've not done something like this before. I also chose something with checks, which can be a blessing or a curse. It was kind of a curse in the cutting out process because I wanted to make sure that the lapels and the front of the coat, that the checks lined up nicely and were somewhat pattern matched so that it didn't look off kilter. So I had to really think carefully about that when I was cutting out, and it did mean that I got very short of fabric. I made this out of 3 metre length of fabric and I only just had enough. So checks can make it really difficult in that way. You also, when you're putting your seams together, have to be really careful about how you're sewing them in order to get things to match up nicely when you've got any sort of pattern, particularly a straight line pattern like a check. Checks, however, in some areas can be really useful. So when I was sewing the hem on this, which is the last part, just goes straight across the fabric. And I was able to use the checks to turn under that hem and make sure that I got a really crisp finish along the back. So the checks played in my favour in that instance. But when it came to cutting it out, making sure that everything was matching and nice and looked professional, I had to take a lot of extra time at that part of the process. Perhaps for your first go, choose a plain fabric that's really not going to matter. It's going to be a lot easier when you're cutting it out. And a coat is generally a lot of pieces to cut out, so you want to make that as easy as you can for yourself. Third big area that I want to talk about is interfacing and underlining. These are slightly different things, but similar. Interfacing is the stiffening, strengthening material that you would generally fuse, but sometimes you would sew in to the facings and any areas that need extra stability, extra support to support the structure of the clothing. You may be familiar with interfacing from sewing lots of other different types of items, things like shirts and trousers, waistbands, that kind of thing. In a coat, it's pretty essential. So as you can see on this coat, this inside piece, this facing piece on the inside that's made out of the outer fabric, forms the lapel shape when combined with the outer coat fabric. Now, this facing piece, in order to retain the nice structure and be stiff enough to hold that shape, needs to be interfaced. I used a medium sort of weight interfacing for those pieces. But I actually fused to every single piece another type of interfacing, which was a thermal interfacing to all the big pieces. So the entirety of the sleeves, the front of the coat sections, the whole of the back, everything was actually essentially interfaced with this, just with a slightly different type of interfacing. It was a slightly more flexible one that had thermal properties so that I could make this a really nice warm coat. With really nicely made coats that you would buy in shops, a lot of them are completely underlined to give proper structure and stability to the fabric. You'll probably also find if you underline every single piece, it will make the outer fabric hang better, it will give a much more professional looking finish and improve the entire look of the coat, as well as making it warmer and stabilising the fabric so that your finished item is going to last a lot longer and hold its shape really nicely for you. So we've got our fabric, we've decided on a pattern, and we've had a think about whether we need to underline or interface all the pieces. You've gathered all those materials. What are some things that I found particularly useful with making this that I think are probably pretty essential for most coat making? First of all, you're going to probably want something like this. It's a pressing ham. Now, these are available lots of places online, lots of sewing stores will sell them. They are usually finished with a wool fabric finish. You often see them in like a tartan check. And the pressing ham is particularly useful because it has lots of different shapes and sizes of curves as you go round. And the idea of this is that you would put that under the seam that you're trying to press and it will create a nice curve. So if you've got a slightly curved seam, like a side seam going down your item, if you're trying to press a slight curve where a sleeve meets the body and you're finding it difficult because it's just not a flat seam and you need that slight curve, something like this is really, really useful to put underneath it on top of your ironing board and gives you the nice curved shape so you can get a really crisply pressed seam. Alongside that, A sleeve roll is also a useful thing to have. I've seen people doing all sorts of things with rolling up towels and newspapers and all sorts of things in order to create something like this. But since I got one, it has been used on almost every project I make. It is particularly useful when you're trying to press nicely the arm sleeve, obviously, but any small areas where you're needing a nice curved sort of surface, something solid in which to press, and it's difficult to get into that area, this sort of shape of sleeve roll along with the bigger pressing ham are super useful. Now these ones are, because I'm a vegan and I don't use any wool products, my husband managed to find me a really nice lady in Cornwall by the name of Craft Cornwall by Diane and Sue. So 2 lovely ladies. They actually bespoke made these so that they didn't have any animal products in and they didn't have wool fabric on, which I didn't want, and they're made out of a really nice cotton canvas. I can confirm these work perfectly well. You don't have to have one with a wool covering, and in fact you can actually make these yourself. You will be able to find, with a quick search, lots of different tutorials on how to make proper sleeve rolls and pressing hams. So if you have the time and the inclination to make one, you can make some of these yourself. I use these on almost every project I make. Super useful. Next thing that I would really highly recommend, particularly for something like a coat project when you've got fabrics that aren't going to behave, or thicker fabrics, or even very slippery fabrics, such as this very slippery polyester lining, I would recommend getting yourself some clips. I think these are often called Wonder Clips. I don't know what brand these are. I was bought them as a present and I didn't use them for ages because I was always a pins girl. And then the more I've used them on different projects, the more I have kept using them because I think they're great. I've got a couple of different sizes here. Big ones and little tiny diddy ones. They are really good for something like this. I don't think I used a single pin in the process of making this. You might be thinking, oh, that thin lining, better with pins, but actually these little clips were great for the lining because unlike pins where your pieces of fabric can slide away from each other, actually these hold the seam allowance much firmer as you're putting it through the machine. So if they're sliding about all over the place, these are going to hold them much firmer, I find, than pins. And then something like these big ones are really great for getting around these big areas of double thickness coat fabric that if you try to put pins through that before sewing those seams, you're going to have difficulty keeping your pins and keeping the fabric flat. And using something where you just clip the edges of it several times along and remove those as you sew along is going to hold your fabric a lot better than pins would. So get yourself a couple of packs of little clips, keep them by your sewing machine. They are absolutely essential for this. I couldn't have been without them. Next thing that I think is an essential is something that looks a bit like this. This is colloquially known as a hump jumper. If you Google search hump jumper, you will be able to come across this item sold by lots of different sewing brands. I know Hemline do them. Mine came for free with my machine. It was one of the tools that came with my sewing machine and I use it all the time. It's basically got a fat end and a thin end, and they each have this gap in the middle so that you can slide it under the back of your pressing foot on your machine, or even the front of the pressing foot, to bridge the gap between a really tall area where you're sewing through lots of thick fabric and the bed of your sewing machine, which obviously is flat. Now, you might have noticed this problem when making things in the past, that when you first start sewing a seam, if you've got any thickness of fabric there, if you're doing like denims or coat fabrics or anything thicker, you find that the presser foot will be at an angle like that because you've got your thick fabric under there and you've just got the bed of the sewing machine there and it's at a funny angle. When you start off trying to sew that seam, your machine is probably gonna create a big bird's nest of threads at the back of your fabric. It's not gonna want to start off very well, and this can cause you lots of problems and seams that are just from the get-go starting off untidy. You might also come across this problem when you get to a point of your seam where you're crossing over some other seams. This, if you try to imagine the crotch of a pair of trousers, for instance, you might have the underleg seam and the crotch seam meeting in the middle, so you've got two seams that you're then having to seam together, and that's a lot of bulk of fabric to get your machine over. And the presser foot is going to have to do this to get over it. Your machine is generally not going to like that very much, but as you're coming up to that seam or moving away from that seam as you sew through it, something like this is great with the little holes in that you can just slide under your presser foot, and it gives that bit of extra height to keep your presser foot level as much as possible, and that's the way it likes to sew best. So get yourself one of these. They're only a few quid. You might even find one with the tools that came with your sewing machine like I did. I use it all the time. Also, if you're in a pinch, recommend that you can do this by folding up a piece of sturdy fabric, for instance, or you could fold up some cardboard, something like that, and you can fashion something like this. All you need really is something to shove under the front or back of your presser foot to level it out, to even it out, and your fabric and what you're sewing is going to go through it so much easier. So, Hump Jumper, excellent tool, used it on practically every seam of this coat. Get one today. Another thing that you might want to consider getting if you're embarking on making a coat or any other complex sort of project is a little bottle of something like this. This is Fray check. And I've had this bottle for years, it lasts ages, you only need a tiny bit at a time. The sorts of things that I use Fray check on are things like buttonholes. So once I've cut through buttonholes, I always stress about the fabric sort of fraying its way through the buttonhole stitching. So I always, after doing a little test to check that it doesn't do anything weird to the fabric, we'll do a little bit of fray check around each buttonhole. It's something that doesn't wash out, it just helps keep the fabric stable at areas that you've cut it. Particularly useful for something like making a coat where you might have a neckline where it joins the shoulder seam. I certainly did on this one, where you've got a funny shaped seam that changes direction abruptly, and because of that you're having to clip into the seam allowance quite a lot, and being worried that that joining part of the seam might start fraying apart, I just popped a little bit of the fray check on that area just to stabilise the fabric, almost like weld and stick it all together at that point. It dries completely clear, you can't tell it's there, you can't even feel that it's there, but it just gives me that extra bit of reassurance that the seams in those places are not going to start finding their way coming apart, where I've had to clip into the seam allowance on the inside. So a little bottle of fray check is good for your anxiety levels and a bit of peace of mind once you've finished everything, to make sure that those seams and the stitching stays where you want it to. Would highly recommend. Useful stuff. Another essential bit of kit when working on most projects, if you want a really nice finish, is another tool for pressing. So as well as your pressing ham and your sleeve roll, you might want to consider a pressing cloth. Pressing cloth is really useful when you're doing things like fusing interfacing. You can put it under what you're doing to protect your ironing board from the sticky fuse from getting all over your ironing board cover. Something like this laid underneath is going to protect that. You can also lay it over your fabric. If you test a bit of your fabric and see what it works like under the iron, you might find that no matter what temperature you're pressing it on, that it creates a shiny, sheeny surface on the fabric whenever you press it or use the iron. Using something like a pressing cloth laid over the top when you're pressing your seams and pressing your fabric might be the only way that you can avoid that. Now, you can buy pressing cloths, but I've been using this one. You can see it's got bits and bobs of interfacing stuck to it at the moment. I do regularly wash this, by the way. This is actually just a piece of cotton bedsheet that was in my 12 fabrics box that I just cut a big rectangle of, overlocked around all the edges so that I can chuck it in the washing machine and it's not going to fray, and it's quite a thin sheet so heat can go through it nice and easily, but it just gives that extra layer of protection when I'm ironing more delicate fabrics or fabrics that need to be protected a little bit more. If you're making a coat out of something synthetic like this that could potentially melt, or you're doing it out of something like wool, you might want to consider using a pressing cloth to protect your fabric that little bit, but still allowing the heat to get to it. The next thing I want you to make sure that you have before you start your coat project is plenty of thread. 100-metre roll of thread is likely not going to be enough for you to make your coat nicely, particularly if you're having to do a lot of top stitching. And I would also recommend, as well as having more than one reel of thread, winding several bobbins before you start anything else so that you don't have to keep stopping to rewind yet another bobbin for the bottom of your machine. I think I got through 4 or 5 bobbins worth of thread making this coat, and I didn't wind any in advance. It was very annoying. I play thread chicken a lot. I quite often run out of thread halfway down a seam, so I really wished that I just had a few bobbins full of thread lined up ready to chuck in so that I could carry on really easily. But I didn't do that. I kept having to stop and unthread the machine and rewind another bobbin. As I said, 4 or 5 I got through. So be prepared, have lots of thread in a colour that matches your fabric or whatever you're using, and you're not going to have that frustration like I did. Alright, so there's a few other things to think of in advance. As I'm sure you're gathering, a project like this requires quite a lot of forethought and planning. And there are a few other things that I think are worth mentioning. First of all, for this, with a particularly difficult fabric, I marked my notches in my seam allowance with chalk rather than clipping into the seam allowance. This was for a couple of reasons. First of all, the style arc pattern that I used had very small seam allowances. They were only 1 centimetre, or I believe that's 3/8 of an inch. That's not much of a seam allowance to play with. You don't have much leeway for mistakes and errors and things going wrong with that. So if you've got a particularly small seam allowance, you probably don't want to be clipping notches into it because you're just weakening the fabric at that point. So marking it with something like chalk or a chalk pen when you're cutting out your pieces and marking all your pattern markings on there is probably a good idea. Speaking of creating weakness in your seams, I also didn't want to cut notches because this fabric, as I mentioned, was a complete fray monster. It wanted to fray at every available opportunity, and I didn't want to be clipping into the seam allowances and encouraging more of that fraying to happen. It's just going to create weak spots at certain parts of the seams where things could potentially start fraying apart, and the stability of my seams was not going to be there. So I marked them instead of clipping them in. So think about doing that. If you are making a lined coat, as I said, you've probably picked up a pattern that is for a coat with a lining. But if you haven't, and you are thinking about doing what I did and taking an unlined pattern and lining it, make sure you put your pockets on at the right point. I almost forgot to do this because quite often patch pockets, like are on this coat, are something that I put on really late in the project because I want to see how it sits and position my pockets exactly where I want them to. With a coat that you're putting a lining in, you can't do that. The idea is that you can't, when you've got your lining, the idea is that you can't see any evidence of the pockets on the inside of the coat. Which even with a patch pocket, which you think is just affixed to the outside, if I were to sew that on at the end, you would see where I'd sewn it on the inside of the lining, and it would look really strange and you wouldn't get that nice seamless finish. So this patch pocket that I have attached here, I put on before I even thought about putting the lining and the outer fabric together. As soon as that side seam that it overlaps was sewn, I thought about my pocket placement and exactly where I wanted to put them, and I did both sides at the same time to make sure that they were both put on at the same level. So think about your pockets early. It's kind of counterintuitive when you first start sewing that you need to do things like decide where your pockets are going early on in the process, and for some projects you can leave it a lot later, but for something like this, particularly if you're putting a lining in, you need to be thinking about doing your pockets early on in the process as possible. So that's another thing to think about and not to forget to do. And another thing that you want to be thinking of putting in nice and early is a hanging loop. Lots of coat patterns that I have come across do not include one of these. I've even had patterns for dressing gowns and other items of clothing that you would commonly want to hang up on a hook that don't have a hanging loop as part of the pattern. And I find this really annoying because you've got to have something in which to hang it up with. The neckline of this coat doesn't lend itself to just hanging up on the back of the fabric, so I had to put a hanging loop in. It doesn't come as part of the pattern. It's not suggested anywhere in the pattern that I could see, so I knew I was going to have to add one. Quite often I would add a hanging loop on the inside of this seam here. So you've got your collar piece, whatever shape collar you have, where it attaches on the inside to this seam here at the top of the back is where I would use that seam and put the two ends. I would make a little loop and put the two ends of my loop into the back of that seam as I'm making it. But in this instance, I felt like it was going to make that lovely flat seam a bit too bulky across the back there. Where it was going to sit on the back of my neck, I wanted to make sure it was nice and smooth. So I actually got a bit fancy with this. And it's something that's not very expensive, but is a really nice detail if you're making a gorgeous bespoke coat. And I got myself a metal chain type loop that I could sew in. That, because I've sewn it in really well, is solid enough that I can hang the coat up. You know, when I go to the hairdressers or whatever and they take my coat, I'm not going to be nervous about them using that. It's sewn in really solidly. And I've sewn it in at a really strong point of the top of the back of the coat where all the layers are sewn together really solidly, several layers of fabric. So it's a really solid point at which to do it. Because I've attached it at that seam line, it also means that when it's hung up like that, it's not distorting any of the fabric. If I were to attach that further down, and that's where the coat hung from the lining, it would potentially start distorting that fabric, possibly forever. So I attached it at a point that was really solid. Now I didn't have to think about that too much in advance. I did think about what I was going to do about a hanging loop in advance, but I attached it. It was the last thing that I did on this coat because I was able to just sew it in nice and neatly by hand once I had done everything else. But if you're wanting to add a fabric loop out of one of the fabrics that you've included in the project and you're wanting to put it in that seam, it's going to have to be sewn into that seam when you sew that seam, which is quite early on in the project. So you want to be thinking about putting that in nice and early on. And if you read through all your pattern details and there is no mention of a hanging loop, you're going to have to devise a solution for that in advance. Lots of coat patterns don't include them. I don't know why. They really should. Doesn't everybody think that this is an essential part so you can hang your coat up? So you've done all the construction of your coat. You've chosen a nice easy pattern. You've chosen fabric you think you can work with. You've chosen a pattern that's suitable for the type of coat that you want to make, that's got nice simple style lines, and your first coat is nearly complete. The thing that I want to remind you of at this point is that those finishing details really matter if you want a really professional, swish looking coat by the end of this. It is worth taking your time with the finishing touches, such as the nice metal hanging loop that I just showed you. Something like that, nice quality bit of hardware, can really elevate this item above something that you might buy in a regular shop. Taking time over any buttons, buttonholes, or fastenings that you might be doing. This is a coat that I actually do have some sew-on big giant poppers that I might put on it, but I'm going to try wearing it as a loose open coat before I put any fastenings on it. I just want to see how it is before I put any fastenings on, because I suspect I'm going to wear it open all the time anyway and I won't need any. Finishing touches and taking your time over these really does matter. One place that you can't even see that I really took my time over with this was the back of the neckline. This is an area, as I said before, I wanted it nice and flat. I wanted the collar to sit nicely. It's quite this design of coat where the collar is high at the back and then falls down into the lapel. I wanted that to look really graphic and smart and quite stiff and stable once I'd finished everything. So I did find that before I took this last finishing step that I was finding the facing part, the inside of this collar and the outside, were not sort of sitting quite together, and they were misshaping this collar a little bit. So what I wanted to make sure I did is attached the inside and the outside of the collar together so that they sit as one and sit really nice and smart like that. The way that I did that, they recommend in the pattern that you do a sort of stitch in the ditch along here, but I've got so many layers of fabric in this at this point, and I was a bit worried about those seams perhaps not matching up exactly, that if I stitched in the ditch from the outside it might not match up with the ditch on the other side, and I was worried that it just wouldn't have the finish that I would like. So what I decided to do to get a really nice finish on the inside and the outside, completely invisible, is I stitched in the ditch but did it by hand so I could see exactly where the needle was going in and coming out on the other side, and stitch exactly in that seam line so it became completely invisible, but just joined the inside and the outside together at that point to get that really crisp finish on the collar section. And the last thing that I want you to do with your brand new coat once you've made it is enjoy it. Enjoy wearing it, wear it as much as you can. There are not many people who can make their own coat, and I think it's a really special item that can last years and years in your wardrobe. If you make a really fabulous coat, people are going to notice and you'll be able to say, thanks, I made it, which is just one of the best things in the world to be able to say, isn't it? I think it is anyway. So enjoy wearing your coat and look after it too. Consider that you are probably, when you want to clean this, this big heavy item that has lots of construction and technique in it, you're probably going to want to get it dry cleaned when you want to wash it. And I would also recommend getting yourself a decent hanger to hang it up. Despite the fact that you've put that hanging loop in at the back that we spoke about for when you're out and about, when it's at home, consider putting it on a hanger and not just chucking it on a hook. It will keep the shape of the shoulders and the neckline so much nicer. It's really going to protect it and you'll be able to store it nicely. Certainly over the summer when you're not using a winter coat, you want to either fold it up very carefully, put it away somewhere, or hang it properly. So a hanger that is nice and sturdy, particularly one that has the wider shoulder sections, is going to be your friend with this. So I think that's all of my tips and advice for making a coat. I hope if you're embarking on your first coat that some of this advice has been helpful. I hope if you have done something like this before that you might have picked up something new from what I've learned making this that might help you with your next project. And if you would like to see more content like this where we discuss different techniques, tools and tips for sewing certain types of fabrics and certain types of projects, then please let me know in the comments. If you've got any questions, also chuck it down there. I really do try to reply to everyone. And please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell if you're interested in seeing more from me. I'm going to leave it at that. I've been waffling on for far too long already. So enjoy all your creating, crafting, sewing and coat making, and I will see you next time.